sometimes when people think about getting involved, we center our feelings of wanting to feel good as opposed to like centering actually what we're doing this for. And that's the difference between like charity work and justice work, right? And so all of the things I suggested are really boring. There's no good selfies you can take out of it, but it's actually really important transformational work. And I think that's the stuff that we're really missing.
You're listening to Dignity and Joy, a podcast from FoodShare. On the pod, we confront the systems of oppression that impact who has access to food and the land it's grown on, and who doesn't. Achieving something better will take hard work from all of us, and can only be done if we listen closely to the people who are already leading change in the way we think about food. FoodShare's Sheldomar Elliott delves into the connections between food and justice with folks who have their fingers on the pulse and their hands in the soil. Together, they dream in color and consider what it would take to build a just and hopeful city. A city where everyone can feed themselves, their loved ones, and their community with dignity and with joy.
Hi, I'm Sheldomar Elliott, and welcome to this episode of Dignity and Joy, a podcast from FoodShare. Today, our guest is Lorraine Lam. Lorraine is a Chinese-Canadian settler immigrant who has been a crisis outreach worker and case manager in the downtown east of Toronto for over 10 years, supporting people who are unhoused and precariously housed. She is currently the drop-in coordinator at Cummer Avenue United Church. Her work focuses on housing and homelessness, systems navigation, advocacy, harm reduction, and trauma-informed approaches to collaboration, survival, and building a more equitable and just reality for all. She organizes with Shelter Housing Justice Network and was a contributor to Displacement City, and has done a number of podcasts and media conversations on spacing, TVO's Agenda, Toronto Star's This Matters, and more recently CTV's The Social. She loves naps, carbs, and her very extroverted puppy, Miso. Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you so much for having me. I think Miso might try to make an appearance. So if you hear him in the background, I am so sorry.
No, Miso is more than welcome to the conversation. All good. Well, before we get into it, I do want to acknowledge that I'm here in Toronto, sacred land that is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that this territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenants. And at FoodShare, we think it's important to start any conversation on this land by recognizing the many nations of Indigenous peoples who presently live on this land, those who have spent time here, and the ancestors who have hunted and gathered on this land. I also want to acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will, and made to work on these lands. At FoodShare, we believe that advancing Indigenous sovereignty is deeply and inextricably linked to Black liberation, and we remain committed to advancing both. Well, Lorraine, considering that this is your first time on the podcast, something we like to do at the beginning is sort of start off with some icebreakers as a way to get the conversation rolling.
Okay.
Is that something you're up to doing?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, let's do it. So I got a few here. And off the top, I'm thinking, what is your go-to comfort food on gloomy springish days like today?
Oh, okay. It's either going to be a bag of potato chips or a bowl of white rice with a little bit of Maggi sauce.
Okay. I got to ask.
So specific.
No, I love it. And I swear, like, potato chips are also my comfort food. So I have to ask a bit more, like, what was your go-to in that moment?
Okay. I am either like a Lay's barbecue flavor person or a Miss Vicky's, that sour cream, the blue bag.
Yes.
Yeah,
Delicious.
definitely not into the pickle or the vinegar. I'm not into that flavor.
Okay, no. Fair.
Mm-hmm.
I think my go-to is always spicy chips. So anything spicy, I'm like, I'll eat up.
Okay. Yeah. I can get behind that. Yep.
What's the last great TV show or movie that you feel like you watched?
I love Abbott Elementary.
Oh.
It is so good. And I'm very looking forward to the third season being out on Disney+. But yeah, that has been a favorite so far.
Such a wholesome show.
Mm-hmm.
If you had your own late night talk show, who would be your first guest?
Whoa. Oh my gosh, that's a good one. John Oliver, I think.
I like it guest to guest, huh?
Yeah. Just kind of like, it'd be kind of meta to like interview someone who does the interview. So I
Right.
think he would have some really fun insights. And he seems like kind of grounded with like how the world works. So I'm into that.
I like it.
Mm-hmm.
If you could become an instant expert in something, what would it be?
An instant expert in something, what would it be? I want to be that kind of person who can just like stand in front of a stove with a pan and just like put together a thing. You
Mm,
know, I think about like whenever I ask my mom, like, Mom, how'd you make that? And she'd be like, Oh, you just like, just a little bit of this and that. And I'm like, Well, how much? And she's like, I don't know, just eyeball it.
yeah,
I cannot eyeball it. So I want to be that person.
I feel that. That is still something I'm trying to learn also with my mom.
Yeah.
Shout out to moms. I don't know how they do it, but
Yeah,
they do
truly. Mm-hmm.
that. Last one I got here. It's a little weird, but stick with me.
Okay.
Would you rather travel back in time to meet ancestors or to the future to meet descendants?
Oh, ancestors.
Hmm.
Yeah. I had a really cool opportunity a couple of years ago to be in China, where I was in like the little village where my grandparents were born. And just kind of seeing how they grew up, I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. Because if this is the landscape in which you grew up in, I can totally appreciate some of the decisions that probably were made.
Mm.
So I'd love to go all the way back and get to know some of the people that came before me. And I'm also just afraid of our future and where we're headed. So let's just leave that.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Fully with you. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for answering all those questions.
Yeah. Fun questions.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's so much that we can talk about, and I'm really excited to jump into some topics. But I think it
Mhm.
makes sense for me and maybe listeners to understand a bit more about you and sort of like uh, how did you get into this work and like your upbringing into what you're doing today.
Yeah. It's a funny question because I think like sometimes there's people think like, oh yeah, she probably always wanted to get involved with working with people who are unhoused or precariously housed, and that is absolutely untrue. Um, I was definitely the kid graduating from high school that was like, I have no idea what I wanted to do. Wanted to take a break from school, but my mom was like, no, if you take a break, you're never going back. So just like do something in university. So I actually went to school for music. Um, and I was like, oh, I don't know what I'll do. Maybe something musical. Who knows? Um, but when I was going to school downtown in Toronto, I was just really floored by how I would like get off the subway and like walk to class, and like along my way to class there were just like so many people who were like clearly unhoused or precariously housed on my way to class. And I'll never forget, like in my first year I had to like get a textbook for one of my music classes, so I went into like a music store on Bloor to pick up a few textbooks, and I had to like step around somebody's sleeping bag in
Mhm.
order to get my books. And then that was just weird. And then it was just like a really strange feeling, really unsettling feeling to then like grab my books that I just paid too much money for because textbooks. And then like walk around this gentleman who was sleeping in the alcove and then just go back to my class. Everything was just like the juxtaposition of all of it was so wrong to me. And I think growing up, I was always also just like really curious about why people ended up in the, you know, areas of life they were in. Growing up in a pretty conservative church setting, that we were always taught like, love your neighbors. But then I was always like, well, why are our neighbors in these kinds of life situations, right?
Mm.
And so I think all of those things just kind of collided together. And in my first year of university, I decided like, well, you know what, I'm just going to try to meet some people that I want to help people and try to understand people's narratives and stories. And so I decided that I would try to help at a meal program just like across the street from campus. And we just established that I don't really cook, so me helping in a meal program was completely unhelpful. And the lovely volunteer coordinator was just like, you know what, why don't you just go talk to people and get to know folks? And that's honestly how it started. I
Mm.
met people. I showed up at the same time every week, sat in the same spot, met the same people. And very quickly, I realized that the things that I thought I knew about housing and homelessness and poverty, I actually had no idea. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of how I entered this space in this work.
Yeah, wow. That honestly resonates with me a lot. Being I guess, alumni of Toronto Metropolitan University, I had similar experiences
Yeah.
going to school on campus and having to walk around or over people. And the fact that it was just like a normal thing
Yeah.
also really irked me.
Yeah.
I'll say that some of that even informed my decision to like get into food security work. And I started with that on campus, similarly to
Yeah.
you, but eventually broadened out and was like, wow, like this is not just a campus problem. Like this is like people in Toronto.
Yeah.
So I guess if we can elaborate a bit on that, like after spending time with folks and getting to hear stories and now doing the outreach work that you are doing, like perhaps we can discuss like what are some of those root causes of houselessness, sorry, and perhaps some misconceptions around that.
I mean, I think there's so many
Yeah.
misconceptions, but I think the big one that, I definitely grew up hearing, and I hear a lot today too, is, like that rhetoric, like, oh, those people should just get a job, right? And I think like that statement in itself just captures so much in terms of what I think people assume about homelessness and what actually is happening. I think like we live in this reality that seems to just think that if everybody just works harder and tries harder, then they'll just make it,
Right.
And sure, every now and then we hear like a feel good story about somebody who like grew up rough and then like, landed a great opportunity and ta-da, now they're doing great and giving back to the community. And that's great. But that is definitely not the majority of what's happening. And I think like, when we talk about root causes of homelessness, my hope is that we can ask better questions with curiosity to just kind of understand why. And for me, like the longer that I spend in the community with people, some of the common themes that I hear around why people are unhoused, truthfully, is a lot of it is like rooted in our systems.
Right.
There's the conversation about how social assistance rates are not livable. Minimum wage is not livable. What is defined as affordable housing is not affordable. Then you have all of these isms that potential landlords maybe like subconsciously hold and don't realize, where like they're less likely probably to rent a place out to somebody who's Black as opposed to someone who's not, right? So things rooted in racism and sexism and classism. I think those are all things that contribute to why people end up unhoused. And of course, there's a lot of like life realities that are just out of our control. I often, there's this card game that I used to play when I was a kid. It was called like President, the winner of the game, like all the cards are dealt randomly, right? And then you play the round based on whatever random cards you get. And then the winner, in the next round gets to keep the two best cards and give their two like worst cards to the person who lost. And the person who lost gives their two best cards to the person who won. So now they have a really stacked hand.
So unfair.
So unfair. And I think like when we talk about it in the context of the card game, I think people like, oh yeah, like we can resonate with that. But that's exactly what happens in life, right? Like we're just dealt a bunch of random cards. Like I didn't get to choose what color skin I was born into, what family I was born into, what country, what city. And I just had to work with the cards that I got. And I think truthfully, some of the root causes around homelessness is rooted in some of those random cards that people are dealt, and people are doing the best that they can to survive.
Absolutely. Wow. I think that's a great analogy to use to understand that.
Yeah.
And I also used to play president, and I was also really good at president. But even in those moments, you're like, this is so unfair, because like, how are those folks who were dealt those worst hands expected to get better or win the next round or whatnot?
Totally.
And like, it really, I think the issue with houselessness in Toronto, and I want to bring up some examples soon, but it's very much interconnected with the issues that we work through with food insecurity. And I think folks sometimes forget that, because these conversations are often had separately. But instead of understanding, like when people struggle to afford housing, they're often prioritizing rent over buying food, and it's through food insecurity, etc. And I guess I've also heard you talk a bit about like visible and invisible houselessness. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Can you maybe share a bit about the difference there?
So visible homelessness is, kind of like what it sounds like, right? Like people that you see who are obviously unhoused. So these might be people who are, sleeping on the sidewalk, on the grates, or like people living in encampments, or people riding transit overnight. Those would be visible homelessness.
Mm,
Um, Invisible homelessness are the people who have no housing of their own. So even like the way that I think it's like homelessness hub or Fred Victor, like how homelessness is defined is basically like a situation where a person or a family or a community does not have stable, safe, and permanent housing or the prospective means to acquire it.
mm,
So that's like the Canadian definition of homelessness. And so if you think about that, that means that anybody who is couch surfing, for instance, they might not be sleeping outside and you might not see them, but they don't actually have a lease in their name,
mm.
right? That would be a form of invisible homelessness. I also talk a lot about people who are incarcerated. There are people who are incarcerated who actually, have no address of their own, but while they're inside the system, they're not thought of as being homeless, right? So that's another example of invisible homelessness, I would say. And a thing to flag about invisible homelessness is, for instance, Toronto's Streets to Homes program, they don't work with people who are not sleeping on the street. So people who might be crashing at a friend's, they don't have access to these services.
Right.
And so it's a really vulnerable group of people, often families as well, who have no access to their own stable housing, or they know that they can't acquire it. And so I think the conversation around invisible homelessness definitely is one that is not addressed enough, but it's a really big problem.
Hmm. And like, I think even using the language of like invisible, it almost makes it feel like I don't want to say not real, but like, damn, you're making me think about a lot of people that I know in my own life who have couch surfed for a long time, and like people in my
Mm-hmm.
family in particular. And that's just like a means of surviving day to day, but without stable housing, it makes things really difficult to like
Mm-hmm.
have that stability and that security.
Totally.
Of course, yeah, that's yeah, it's making me just reflect on my own on people I know, and I guess
Yeah. I think a lot too about like people with children, right? And
mm,
so I think that's something. So the family shelter system right now is beyond full. I was speaking with a colleague who works specifically in the refugee sector, and I believe the wait for a family shelter right now is about 250 days.
oh my gosh,
And so if you think about that in the context of somebody, a family with children, um, so I really appreciate actually that you talk about the interconnectedness of housing and food security and all that stuff. So if you have a family with a few kids, and they're facing eviction or they have been evicted, because that's a big thing happening with rent evictions right now, they've got kids in school probably, right?
mm,
And so they're not going to be moving into an encampment. Of course not, because also if you saw a family with children living in a tent, most likely child welfare services would be called, and that's a whole another situation, right? And it's like taking kids from their family, that's going to be more trauma, and how does that destabilize families? But then you think about the kids who are, in school and are like not living in a place where it's stable, or they have access to like food security or housing security. If there's like 5 kids like sharing one bedroom, all of those stuff, that stuff affects how a kid does in school.
yeah,
And so then when we talk about the importance of child development and how important education is, if children are not able to have access to a quality of life that enables them to pursue education well, then we can kind of like play the tape forward, and that's not it. It's a difficult reality, and a lot of kids end up not doing so well under those circumstances, right? And so I
right.
think that's a piece of invisible homelessness that I don't think we talk about in terms of making the connections between like education and children and child welfare and all of that stuff. But it's more and more becoming a reality for sure.
Absolutely. And it just makes me like this whole like fast forward thing. Like, I imagine that's how a lot of these cycles are replicated and like continue,
Mm-hmm.
especially intergenerationally. Um, it's wild, and yeah, it's making me think about a lot of things. But what
Yeah.
I'm really realizing is that a lot of this is happening in Toronto, the city that
Mm-hmm.
we're both in right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess as someone who is on the ground and has been doing this work for a long time, like what, I guess, and I feel like this is kind of obvious, but like what are the state of things in the city? And more particularly, like, are you seeing, what are you seeing from local government in terms of trying to address this issue, if at all?
The state of things in the city, I mean, to put it very simply, is that things are getting worse.
Yeah.
Worse in that the number of people that are becoming unhoused is increasing. And I guess I want to make it a point here too, to name that like all people, no matter what status they are in the city, deserve access to shelter and housing. There is a really awful rhetoric happening right now that kind of says like, well, you know, we can't even take care of the people in our own city. How dare we bring in new immigrants and refugees? And I think that rhetoric is so problematic and so racist and xenophobic.
Talk about it.
Because like that rhetoric makes it sound like the problem is that we don't have enough resources, but the problem is actually we have a hoarding of resources problem.
Right.
You know, the fact that we have landlords with multiple properties, that is the problem. So the original point was, yeah, so things in the city are getting worse because we are just seeing increasing numbers of people who are becoming unhoused. You know, the news talks a lot about how expensive groceries are and how food bank lineups are like tripling, quadrupling. I think there was a study by, was it Second Harvest or one of the food groups that was talking about. Oh, yes, that's right. That was like, about 1 million people in this country are about to like use food banks for the first time this year. Yeah. So obviously like things are getting worse. Mm-hmm. And I think we're also seeing that people who are not usually even plugged into these conversations are noticing it as well. And I think we started to see that during the pandemic, especially when they, you know, people who traditionally were able to kind of just like turn an eye on all these things and kind of go about their lives are starting to pay attention to it because I think it's starting to feel closer to home. For instance, you know, people who are living in condo buildings around encampments, they're now like more upset about encampments. You know, whereas before, like I think there was a lot more homelessness maybe in the ravine. So it was just like more out of sight, right? But I think now it's just like really in all of our faces because things are so bad. And in terms of like, you know, what governments are doing feels like a constant question in terms of like, what are you doing? And we're seeing municipal governments across the country name that like homelessness is in a dire state of emergency. However, these proclamations feel really empty when there's no actual action being backed. So a really good example is, for instance, when the pandemic sort of arrived at our doorstep in 2020, there was like this national recognition that like, oh my gosh, this is a public health emergency. And so all these things were mobilized, including CERB, right? There was like immediate action taken. Mm-hmm. We're seeing with housing, we're like, okay, so yes, housing is an emergency, but yet like everything is just going business as usual and nothing is changing.
Right.
And that is really frustrating. And so the conversation around like what governments are doing, it often feels like it's not enough. You know, we see sort of like municipal governments reaching out to the province and feds and they're like, we need money to build things. We in Ontario, there is no plan. We currently have a provincial government that is not interested in affordable housing. Ford is instead wanting to spend $46 million on police helicopters. You know, and there's no money put into like housing, right? And so there's that question. And then you see the federal government with no like national strategy whatsoever. So there are significant gaps in all three levels. And then the bigger gap is that there's no coordination between all three levels. So it constantly is this deflection back and forth. And so what's happening instead now is now you have all these people who are most affected by the housing crisis. And then you have other people that are, you know, getting into these strange conspiracy theories and like turning on each other instead of actually putting all of this energy towards the government to like mobilize.
Yeah. That is getting me going because there's so much there. First off, I wish I could curse and I'm not going to because we're on a podcast, but Ford is really doing us dirty in terms of housing stuff. And I know there's been a scandal in the past year with where this money is going and his friends and all this stuff. So it's wild. And I think you also bring up the really important fact of like regular ordinary people are blaming like folks and asylum seekers and refugees and people immigrating into the
Mm-hmm.
country for this issue, but it
Mm-hmm.
really is a matter of reallocating resources and
Yeah.
not hoarding them. It's also making me think about, like, I understand like houselessness and being like living on the streets is sort of a really severe situation of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about young people and people who are a little bit maybe younger than me or older than me who are also like, where do we live? And
Yeah.
I know there's statistics. I haven't been able to come across them in terms of like people who are just leaving Toronto and are trying to go to like suburbs or maybe just leaving the province altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really multifaceted in terms of like how this problem is manifesting and how it's
Mm-hmm.
impacting people's livelihoods.
Totally. There was a podcast, I think it was Canada Land's Backbench podcast, and they were talking about this like mass exit of people from big cities like Toronto. So I think you were even saying like there was a lawyer. I mean, lawyers are, supposed to make decent money, and they're like, no, we can't afford to live in this city. Right. And so it's something that's going to affect everybody in the country. And I think, not traditionally, but like in the past, I think a lot of folks used to think of, the conversation around homelessness and such as being, oh, it's just like the big cities in the country. But we're seeing like encampments and stuff across now, like, even like our neighbors in Peterborough, Port Hope, like Colborne, these like smaller towns are seeing a lot more people who are living in encampments because, again, the cost of living and housing across the country is so problematic. And I would actually say like that is such a huge driving factor of why homelessness is on the rise. When we talk about like the cause of homelessness, I think, instead of constantly like asking questions of what the individual person could have done differently, I think we need to spend more time talking about why is it that we have turned housing into commodity where developers can profit off of. I think that's actually such a big part of conversation that we don't talk about enough. Specifically in Toronto, for instance, there is a property developer named Kingset, for instance, and they've been purchasing land across the city, Parkdale, East End, and they're developing it, and also the cause of a lot of dumb evictions. But why are they constantly raking in more money at the expense of people who are about to end up on the street?
Right.
We don't talk about that. Like, who's making these deals? Why are developers continuing to profit? Why are we even allowing that? Where is the government sort of interventions around the financialization of housing? There's none of that happening, and that definitely needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. And it like, I feel like we could see this in so many different places, but it's always trying to put the blame on like the symptoms rather than address like the core of the problem. And a lot of it links back to poverty, unfortunately, which is a systemic issue. Yeah, it makes me think about so much. It also makes me think about like the city budget and like there's supposed to be money there, but it doesn't seem like it's being used well. And I know that some folks had hope with the new mayor that was elected a few months ago, but things don't seem to be going so great, unfortunately. I guess when thinking about the macro sort of picture of all this, do you know of or are aware of any sort of global models that address homelessness in a way that like maybe the city could better look at or consider when also trying to tackle this situation?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, but I want to backtrack a little bit to like our current mayor. I think like she definitely has a responsibility for sure in city budget and numbers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to recognize too that she inherited an absolute dumpster fire.
Right.
From our previous administration. So like if folks aren't following, like if we look at the numbers and the amount that's being spent on the FIFA World Cup,
okay.
Right? Like I think it came up in a recent city council meeting where I think originally it was just supposed to be a few million, but all of a sudden it's actually showing that it's going to be like 300 something million and the cost going up. And I think it was Councillor Matlow who kind of said like, who okayed this? Who at the previous administration and city staff, right? Like who approved this? And I think like, I'll admit that I'm definitely still trying to figure out how like municipal politics work. And I think like, yes, the mayor has some power, but I actually think we need to ask a lot of questions about the city's staffing team who approves these things, because the mayor doesn't single-handedly decide like, I'm going to, do this thing.
Of course.
There's a team of people that like veto it or vote on it and stuff like that. That's kind of how ideally democracy works. And so while Chow, I think, has been disappointing in some areas, I want to name that like she inherited a complete mess. And that I think we're not holding all people to account that we need to. That said, she's the mayor, so I think she should be responsible for a lot of these things. But I do think we have a larger conversation to have around like who's making these decisions at City Hall. And so, other places that are doing things that work, like I know a lot of folks look to like Scandinavian countries, right? Those countries have problems as well.
Yep.
But I do think, there is a conversation there around like housing and how people have access to it. I think like no place has got it perfect, but I do think a lot about Scandinavian countries in terms of the questions that they're having around access to social programs. I also personally lived in Singapore for a few years. And the Singapore housing model is really interesting to me because they have like a public housing model there. Essentially, like most housing in Singapore is like, they call them HDB. So like the Singapore government basically like is responsible for it.
Okay.
HDB is called like Housing and Development Board. And so it's like a really big part of how housing works there. And a lot of folks in Singapore live in HDB, like my family also does. And like if you want to buy a property, there's like a whole lottery system that happens. So I think about that a lot. Again, like Singapore has a lot of other issues, right? Like, okay, you can't chew gum on the street. So like, there's conversations about like how much quote freedom people have there.
Right.
But homelessness is not a thing there.
Right.
So they figured something out there. And I think a big piece of that is really about the government's sense of responsibility around housing and how it actually benefits the entire country if people have access to housing.
Absolutely. First off, yeah, I think you made a great distinction there in terms of understanding how municipality or municipal politics works. Yeah, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there and accountability to be held. I won't list any names, but I've definitely heard that working in the city is a very slow moving sort of pace.
Yeah.
And it's funny. It's like all like nonprofits and all these folks doing on the ground work. We always feel this sense of urgency, but like when it comes down to the city, it's like non-existent. So it's funny that that's a thing. And I also just took a look at that budget for the FIFA World Cup. They're expecting it to be about $300 million.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. That is ridiculous.
It's absolutely like if you just kind of think about like, so here's the thing I think often too, that like even if people were just heartless and had no compassion on people who are poor or people who are unhoused, truthfully, it's actually just like financially a silly decision to not invest in shelters and housing.
Right.
More importantly, housing, right? Because like it costs like $6,000, I think, for one person to be in a shelter hotel. Like one person.
Right.
$6,000 is like, that could be rent subsidies for so many people. And so you talk about like 300 million for the World Cup. Like I just think about how much money that could be instead of if we actually focus that on like things that are actually going to build the city so that people had access to basic needs. It's wild.
It's so wild. Like what about guaranteed basic income or like social assistance or like supporting livable wage policies? Like I feel like all of those things could better address this issue, but instead soccer.
Yeah. And I had somebody who had the audacity say to me the other day, like, well, poor people want soccer too. And I was like, listen, that does not justify $300 million on the FIFA World Cup. Like that is just absolutely ludicrous. And, I don't think we can talk about this without talking about the cup budget either, right?
I was just about to bring it in.
Yeah. Like policing is not going to solve mental health realities and like unhoused communities like access to things, right? We know that cops also have nowhere to bring people to. And so why are we giving them more money when they're literally not part of the solution? It's just really, really silly. But we have this like societally ingrained idea that like cops will fix all the things. And it starts so young, right? It starts in Paw Patrol.
Yeah, exactly.
And like, I think we have some serious work to do in terms of encouraging our people in our circles to like unlearn some of these things. And again, like ask better questions. If we have a pot of money at the city and we've identified the priorities around housing and food security, and we know the things that are going to be addressing housing and food insecurity is building housing and, like making, sure people have access to food. How do the cops fit into this? And why in the world are we giving them more money when they're not going to solve any of this? It's so bizarre to me.
It's wild. I am not going to put myself on blast too much, but my dad's a police officer.
Okay.
So these conversations come up very often, and it's really hard to have him understand the other side because he's so deeply ingrained in being a police
Right.
officer, and that's
Yeah.
the whole thing in itself.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it's
we can talk after the
yeah.
bus.
We'll decompress around that, but it makes me think about like just having conversations with people who may not be thinking about these things, and
Right.
like you've already brought up a few examples, but like the sort of ignorance or sort of I guess NIMBYism or like not in my backyard kind of thought that you might have to encounter often. And I guess I'm thinking like how do you manage those kind of conversations, and like how do you try to remind people to be compassionate and just be human without without this sort of self-righteous idea, but like genuinely like thinking about each other and making sure that we care about each other. Yeah, like how do you manage that in your work?
I ask myself that every day. Because sometimes I'm honestly just so flabbergasted at the things that people say. I think one of the big things that, like, on a good day, when I'm able to kind of unpack some of these conversations with people, there's a lot of these narratives that are rooted in fear.
Right.
In terms of, especially around like fear of the unknown. And I say that as in like, okay, so people don't like unhoused people in their neighborhoods. And sometimes when you kind of unpack that, that's usually because they're like, well, I don't know if they're going to assault me, or like, what do I do if they're, yelling or whatever. So there's a fear of like not knowing how to respond, which I think like, I'm like, we could practically address that by giving you tools, right? Like de-escalation conversations. There's a fear around, oh my gosh, there's like needle syringes, which I just want to name that like needles are not just falling out of the sky, right? Like there has not actually been a reported case of anybody in the public being pricked by a needle, but this fear is so real. And also, if this fear is about stepping on an uncapped needle, well, the way that we can combat that is actually to put up more needle disposal bins around the city. Like it's a very clear solution we can have. Right. And so I think a lot of these and then there's a more abstract fear in terms of, I think there are people that are just like really afraid of sort of like, oh my gosh, like this is happening. Things are getting so bad. What does this mean for me? And I think we're all sort of wired to have this idea of like self-preservation and wanting to be okay. But yet the responses that we make out of our fear is kind of what dictates our humanity, I think, right? And so I try to remind myself that even the people that are upset about encampments and stuff, there's often a level of fear under there. There's always this desire to protect property over people, which I really struggle to understand.
Seriously.
Like, yeah, people are more upset about their stolen Amazon packages than the fact that like people are living unhoused down the street from them. And I truthfully don't know how to like reconcile that. Yeah. But I think the other piece is I really want to try to find common ground. So yes, people in a certain neighborhood don't want encampments for whatever reasons they have. But I personally don't want people to have to live in encampments either. So that is like a common ground we can be on to say, yeah, okay, so we're on the same page here. Now let's actually ask better questions in terms of why people are in encampments. And sometimes that's where the conversation starts to go sideways because, again, back to the start of the conversation, I think people have these preconceived notions of like, wow, these people just have to try harder or whatever it is. But I think for me personally, like, I operate in my work with people who are vulnerable. Like I try really hard to come from like an anti-oppressive framework, a trauma-informed approach. And like this means applying that as well to the same people that I disagree with, recognizing that they too carry trauma and, have been hurt in their lives and have experienced levels of oppression. And so I think my hope in those conversations is not so much to try to convince people, because I think convincing as a goal is never going to work. But I try really hard to converse with a posture of curiosity, to try to understand where people are coming from. And then honestly, I just try to like give people like, okay, well, that's what you're thinking, but here's what I've observed and this is what I'm seeing. And you can take with that as you please.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's working, truthfully. But I feel like that is what I'm able to do with my capacity at this time.
Absolutely, man. I think it's just so important to be able to meet people where they're at, really. And I see this in my life too. And whether it's family, friends, like I also try my best not to convince people, but like try to offer them like the facts and the stats in a way that isn't overbearing, overwhelming, and just let them understand. But I think you also bring up something earlier too, like there's a bigger thing or issue that exists that we don't have to talk too much about, but like this attachment to materialism and like all of this stuff rather than like the wellness of like people who live around us or in our community. And that's of course a symptom of capitalism, but it's a scary thing to like have to fight against and like to in real time have that conversation about like where's your priority. It could be tough and it could be a little what's what I'm looking for. Yeah, it's just it's it's just hard. It's hard to have.
You talk about that thing about like property, right? If you think about policing, the big narrative around the city budget this time around was like, oh, carjackings are on the rise. Right. So we need more money to protect cars. Like it's just kind of like, okay. And I get it. Yeah, of course. Like when I got my bike stolen, I was so upset. Because it was like, oh my gosh, this is my bike. It's like a part of me. I spent money on this, right? But it was also like, okay, like it happens. You live in the city, shit happens, right? And I think I'm often just kind of like, how do we get to a place where we're more concerned about maintaining the stuff we have than ensuring that people are okay? And I think a lot about, is it possible to teach empathy? Like, is empathy something that can be taught? What do we need to do to move people closer to the radar of like understanding issues and seeing people with compassion? And there's that lawyer, Brian Stevenson. He like wrote that book, Just Mercy, based on his like his experiences as a lawyer in the States, sort of defending people who are wrongfully convicted, facing the death penalty. And I think about this a lot. He said this thing where he was like, you can't solve a social problem from a distance. You have to have proximity to the problem if you want to make a dent. Right. And I think that's so true, right? Because I think a lot of the times when we talk about food insecurity or housing or, racial profiling, all of these things, they get talked about as these abstract ideas. But when you talk to the people who are closest to it, you often hear like, these are like my life stories. Yeah. And so we can't just kind of talk about these things and debate them in our like cushy living rooms and like politician offices when we're not actually close to the realities and to understand. And so I think a lot about like, can we teach empathy and how do we get people to be willing to engage in proximity from a place of trying to understand? I have no answers, so when you figure that out, let me know.
I was hoping you had an answer because I also don't have any.
No, nothing.
But that's something I think a lot about also. And it's something I also try to balance because it's hard to even talk about these things. And I said it earlier, but like this, maybe it's like a me thing, but I'm always trying to not come across as like as self-righteous or being like, well, I know the thing, like we need to do this thing. Yeah. But it's so important. And I guess I'm curious now. And I think I've seen this somewhere, like your website or socials, but you mentioned like you are interested in faith justice. Yeah. And like faith is a big part of you and your work. And I don't want to assume, but I'm guessing that might also be somewhere where your empathy and your compassion may stem from. I would love to hear more about what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I don't know if that's where it stems from. Because if I'm going to be super honest, there are some people connected to the Christian faith space that is some of the most judgmental people and non-compassionate people that I know.
You're literally reading my mind.
So I was like, yeah. So like, sometimes I'm very aware that when I'm like, talking about my own wrestling with my faith journey, it's like a little embarrassing because I'm like, man, like some of my people have caused the most harm, not just like in history, but like currently, right?
Right.
And so I don't really know what to make of that, and I don't know what to do about that, right? Because I think that is something that I hold really closely. So I guess I often think, I mean, without getting into like weird theology stuff here, but
I'm also in for that, but I did it.
I mean, there's like a school of theology in the Christian faith that believes that like it's like that believes in like humanity is like total depravity. That just believes that people are bad.
Right.
And I don't subscribe to that because I actually think so. Again, in my Christian faith, we believe that people are what we call like image bearers, like they are a reflection of divine.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's the case, I don't think we're all inherently bad. Like I actually think we're born, like, you know, if people love children, right? Because we recognize that children have a purity to them. They're just kind of like, they're not messed up by the world just yet, you know?
Yep.
And that's what I think that's what I deeply believe. And so I think like somewhere along the way, the longer of life we've lived, we've been hurt, we've been harmed, we're trying to protect ourselves. And that's when we kind of create all of these like, you know, ideas about people, stereotypes about people. But I kind of believe that if you sift through our mess, I actually think people are good. And I think people are drawn to what's good. I think that's why people are drawn to the feel good stories that we sometimes see in media.
Right.
So I think for me, like my faith informs my work in that I believe that people are not the worst things that they've done. And I think that's what keeps me going and believing that actually like a better reality is possible. But I also think that like a lot of this stuff, like, you know, when we talk about social justice work, I'm a really big believer that the work starts with ourselves, that we have to figure out our own mess and sort out our own baggage and stuff before we try to get out there and, you know, do nice things for other people. Because I think our own baggage will affect the way we interact with people and how we see people.
Definitely.
But yeah, like I think my faith journey is one that's complicated and I'm not really sure what to do with it, but I think it's such a big part of why I continue to do what I do. You know, I haven't really been connected to a church institution in a long time because I've really struggled with, you know, how I have often felt like the church says one thing in their services, but then in real life I see something completely totally different. And I think that's something I'm trying to wrestle through. But I think my connection to spirituality and the divine and the God that I believe in is what sort of keeps me rooted in like what I'm fighting for.
That was really well said, and thank you for sharing. I know it's not always easy talking about those things, but I think throughout the whole conversation I've been resonating with a lot, and I resonate with that too. And like, you know, I grew up Christian. My grandmother is a pastor, and it's great, and I love her. But when dinner comes around, she starts saying certain things. I'm like, okay, this is why I have my own troubles with religion.
Yeah.
So similarly, I'm on my own sort of spiritual path and trying to make things make sense.
Yeah.
But those things definitely keep me grounded and help to inform like how I show up in the world and like how can I navigate this system. And like, for me, I feel like I also don't want to go into theology, but I don't know.
I'm here
like,
for it.
Yeah, I know. You know, like I don't know, but I sense that like there is an interconnectedness with all of life, and it's hard to like, you know, prioritize like the immaterial things that like just dissipate over time rather than like connections and relations and yeah, just like seeing life the way it shows up and recognizing that like we can support, we can help in different ways.
Yeah.
But that proximity piece that you were talking about earlier, that's something that I'm going to be sitting with. I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah. You know, I'm not going to preach, but there is something that I think, there's two things about my faith connection that I think a lot about. The first being that, like, you know, I think a lot about what the conversation around colonization means in this too, right? Because my family is from Hong Kong, so we're Chinese people. And like the only reason that like my family came to faith in the Christian spirituality is because they were like Western people that came to like, you know, do missionary work. And
Right.
so, I think a lot too about what that means in terms of like my Chinese existence in a colonized place, but yet we're also colonizers at the same time. Hong Kong's like a weird thing. What does that mean for my faith?
Right.
And the other piece around my faith too that I think a lot about in this work is that the Christian faith, is rooted in stories about the being of Jesus. And when you read scripture, what's really striking to me actually is that he, according to the stories that we read, he spent a lot of time like walking around and being with people. So
Right.
sure, there's like random stories here and there of him like feeding 5,000, but it's not like he went everywhere and just like launched fish and bread at everyone and that was it and he moved on, right? What is really striking to me is that a lot of the things we read about in scriptures show proximity. Like he talked with people and ate with people. When people asked him questions, he would like respond in dialogue, and there's in the stories where they show his like miracles that he performed or whatever. It's always the stories always kind of talk about somebody saying like help, I need your help, and then his response is, oh, okay, like what do you need? He doesn't just assume what people need, which I think is something that I think in charity mindset, we just assume that we know what poor people need and we just do it for them. No, proximity actually encourages us to have conversations with people and actually ask people what they need and spend time with them before trying to do the things for people. And I think those are really facets of my faith that I think a lot about in my work as well.
Yeah, that is so important. Like trying to understand, like speaking to people and really hearing like what they need rather than just assuming. And I feel like we see a lot of that, just like the band-aid solutions that we see a lot of the time, whether that's like a food bank. Like, of course, folks need to access food,
Yeah.
but it's still going back to what we talked about earlier. Like it's not addressing the core root cause of the problem.
Right.
And speaking about help, and I'm just thinking about this conversation, like what are some maybe tangible ways that folks can take action or support like initiatives that are going on in the city?
Good question. Important one. I think food banks are important, but I always tell folks like, for every donation you give to a food bank, pair that with some kind of a political action. Because ultimately, like, we don't want to just make more food banks. We want to actually eradicate the need for food banks. So like, the reason we have food banks is because people can't afford to live, because minimum wage is not livable, because social assistance is terrible. So like, push for policy changes. So I think that's a really big one for me. Like, I don't want people to think that like donations don't matter, because they do, but I appreciate you naming that they really are such band-aid solutions. So like, get involved politically in changing systems, I would say, as you do donations. I think other ways to get involved. I always also encourage people to start local. So, there are some people who live outside of downtown and sometimes they're like, oh, poverty is a downtown Toronto thing. But no, there's a lot of, hidden poverty in Scarborough, Markham, York region. And so I always encourage folks to like do a quick search on like 211 or something, just to kind of see what existing organizations are out there in your own neighborhood, and find ways to partner locally. Like, don't just come downtown once a week and like, donate to the food banks down here. Like, get involved in your local spaces. I think that's a really big one. And I think, connected to, our conversation about like dialoguing with people, I think like a really big part of the work needs to happen in our own circles. And I think we forget that. Like, I think sometimes when we think about getting involved in trying to make changes, we think a lot about like, okay, I'm going to partner with this organization. I'm going to do this thing out there. I'm going to go on a march. I'm going to do those things. And those are all really good things. But like, the changes really happen in our circles and conversations. For me, like, I need people in my life to gather their people and have conversations with their people in Markham, their people in the conservative church space, for instance. I need those folks to talk to those people, because I'm not going to reach them. I don't know them. I have no relationship with them.
Right.
But like, my people, if you are friends with them, you do. So I always say, like, I think a really important way to get involved is like gather your people, and have these hard conversations. Share articles about what you're learning, encourage people to come alongside you. If you're doing a food bank run, great, bring them along, and then have these conversations. Because I think like that's kind of some of the biggest gaps that I see in terms of, just the lack of accurate information out there. So that's a big one. And so then I also encourage people to find resources to like stay in touch and learn things. So if you're really interested in food insecurity, like look for organizations that center food insecurity to like follow and like learn about the work. Proximity, find ways to be involved like closely. I think those are some ways that I think of in terms of how to practically get involved. And I also realize that none of those sound very glamorous or exciting, which is what I think people want to feel. I think that's why like the Christmas, the Christmas shoebox thing that I'm talking about.
Like a Christmas drive kind of?
Christmas drives, yeah. And there's an organization called like Samaritan's Purse. They pack shoeboxes up with like toys and like send them overseas. And it's a great visual because you get a lot of people who like pack all these boxes, and at the end of the event, you get these like hundreds of shoe boxes packed up, and it's like, look at how great we did. I feel so great. And I think sometimes when people think about getting involved, we center our feelings of wanting to feel good as opposed to like centering actually what we're doing this for. And that's the difference between like charity work and justice work, right? And so all of the things I suggested are really boring. There's no good selfies you can take out of it, but it's actually really important transformational work. And I think that's the stuff that we're really missing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for making that distinction. I think that's a really rich and important thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, leave the selfies at home.
Yeah.
We don't need those.
Especially not if you're like taking a selfie of you dropping off food in an encampment. Like, no.
That's not,
we don't need that.
We really don't.
Uh-huh.
Well, I think this has been such a wonderful conversation, Lorraine. Thank you so much for being here today.
Mm-hmm.
It was truly an enlightening conversation. I feel like we were able to make so many connections between different issues that are all working at the same time, or all happening at the same time, because they're not necessarily working.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experiences with us.
Of course. I'm so glad to be here. This is so good.
Wonderful. Well, if folks want to follow and support your work, where can they find you?
I am pretty easy to find on the internet, for better or for worse. You can find me on Instagram. I am Lorraine Lam Chops. That is me also on Twitter. And I'm just Lorraine Lam out there on the internet. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. So go nuts.
Will do. Well, that's it for this episode. And Dignity and Joy is a podcast from FoodShare Toronto. We're a food justice organization advocating for the right to food and working to challenge the systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the food that they need to thrive. You can learn more about our work at foodshare.net. If you have feedback on the pod, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at info@foodshare.net or on our social media. We're at FoodShareTO on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and on Instagram. Dignity and Joy is produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting, with sound engineering and editing by Mar Tizak. The production team at FoodShare is Renee D'Souza and Andrea Thompson. Special thanks to Amanda Cupido, and thank you so much for listening.